Imagine a war declared not against a human enemy, not over land or resources in the traditional sense, but against birds. Flightless, large, and rather persistent birds. This is the story of the Great Emu War, a peculiar chapter in Australian history that sounds more like folklore than fact. Yet, it happened. It involved soldiers, machine guns, and thousands of emus, all set against the backdrop of a struggling post-World War I agricultural landscape. How did a nation recovering from global conflict find itself in armed conflict with its native wildlife? What were the circumstances that led to such an extraordinary event? And was it truly a necessary measure? Join us as we delve into the details of this feathered fiasco, exploring the context, the conflict, and the curious aftermath of Australia's war against the emus. The story of the Emu War is deeply rooted in the socio-economic conditions of Western Australia in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Following the First World War, the Australian government offered land grants to returning soldiers, encouraging them to take up wheat farming in the marginal agricultural lands of the state. These soldier settlers, many with limited farming experience, faced numerous challenges, including harsh climate conditions, fluctuating wheat prices, and the arduous task of clearing and cultivating vast tracts of land. By 1932, the situation had become particularly dire. The Great Depression had gripped the global economy, sending wheat prices plummeting and placing immense financial strain on the already struggling farmers. Their livelihoods were under threat, and a sense of desperation began to permeate the rural communities. Adding to their woes was the significant increase in the emu population. These large, flightless birds, native to Australia, typically roamed across the landscape in search of food and water. However, the extensive land clearing for agriculture and the provision of artificial water sources for livestock inadvertently created ideal conditions for the emus to thrive and congregate in the cultivated areas. The birds, often numbering in the thousands, began to descend upon the wheat fields, feeding on the crops and trampling the fragile fences that the farmers had erected to protect their livelihoods. Entire harvests, representing months of back-breaking labor and crucial income, were being decimated by the emu incursions. The farmers' pleas for assistance grew increasingly urgent. They appealed to the state and federal governments, outlining the extent of the damage and the severe impact on their ability to sustain themselves and contribute to the struggling economy. They described the emus as a relentless and overwhelming force, their numbers seemingly insurmountable. The memories of their service in the Great War, where they had faced formidable human adversaries, likely fueled their determination to seek government intervention against this new, feathered foe. They saw the emus not just as pests, but as a direct threat to their hard-won farms and their very survival in a challenging environment. The government, under pressure from the affected farming communities and facing its own economic anxieties during the Depression, felt compelled to respond. However, the idea of military intervention against wildlife was unprecedented and likely met with internal debate. The resources of the armed forces were already stretched, and deploying soldiers and equipment for pest control was an unconventional proposition. Nevertheless, the perceived scale of the problem and the vocal demands of the war veterans carried significant weight. The government, perhaps seeking a quick and decisive solution to appease the disgruntled farmers, ultimately decided to authorize a military operation. The decision to involve the military raises serious questions about the necessity and proportionality of the response. Were there alternative, less drastic measures that could have been explored? Could agricultural experts or wildlife management authorities have offered more sustainable solutions, such as improved fencing techniques, deterrence, or controlled culling programs managed by civilian agencies? The deployment of soldiers with machine guns against a native bird species seems, in retrospect, an extreme and perhaps ill-conceived approach. The lack of prior experience in such unconventional warfare and the potential for unintended consequences appear to have been underestimated. The media of the time played a significant role in shaping public perception of the unfolding events. Reports, often sensationalized, painted a picture of an overwhelming emu invasion, portraying the birds as a destructive force that threatened the very fabric of agricultural society in Western Australia. Headlines likely exaggerated the scale of the damage and the ferocity of the emu attacks, contributing to a sense of crisis and justifying the government's drastic response in the eyes of some segments of the public. The narrative presented often lacked nuance, failing to adequately explore alternative solutions or the potential ecological consequences of a military campaign against native wildlife. It is important to consider the perspective of the emus themselves in this unusual conflict. Driven by their natural instincts to find food and water, they were inadvertently drawn to the cultivated lands that had replaced their natural habitat. They were not malicious invaders, but rather animals adapting to a rapidly changing environment. The concept of war in this context is inherently anthropomorphic, projecting human intentions and motivations onto creatures simply trying to survive. The conflict highlights the often unintended consequences of human land use and the complex interactions between agriculture and native ecosystems. The involvement of the Royal Australian Artillery and the deployment of Lewis machine guns underscored the seriousness with which the government approached the issue, at least publicly. However, the choice of weaponry against highly mobile and dispersed targets raises further questions about the strategic thinking behind the operation. Machine guns, designed for engaging human combatants in relatively static positions, proved largely ineffective against the swift and agile emus. The open terrain of the wheat fields further hampered the soldiers' ability to effectively track and engage the birds. The initial deployment of 3 soldiers, under the command of Major G.P.W. Meredith of the 7th Heavy Battery Royal Australian Artillery, commenced in October 1932. The soldiers were equipped with Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The stage was set for an unprecedented battle between man and bird, a conflict that would quickly reveal the limitations of military technology against the unpredictable forces of nature and the sheer resilience of the emu population. The world watched with a mixture of fascination and disbelief as Australia declared war on its native wildlife. Yet the crusade against the emus proved to be a resounding failure. The birds, far from being easily subdued targets, demonstrated remarkable agility and an uncanny ability to evade the soldiers' gunfire. Major Meredith's reports from the field painted a picture of frustration and the surprising resilience of the emu. He was even quoted as saying at one point, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with bullet after bullet, and the same old emu keeps going." This quote starkly illustrates the unexpected challenge the soldiers faced. Despite multiple attempts and thousands of rounds of ammunition expended, the number of emus culled was relatively small, and the impact on the overall population and the damage to the wheat fields remained minimal. The media, initially perhaps supportive of the military intervention, began to portray the operation as a farcical and costly exercise. Reports highlighted the soldiers' lack of success and the seemingly endless waves of emus that continued to plague the farmers. Public opinion began to turn against the war, questioning the wisdom and effectiveness of using military force against wildlife. Faced with mounting criticism and the continued ineffectiveness of the operation, the government eventually withdrew the military personnel. The first phase of the Great Emu War had ended in an undeniable victory for the emus. However, the farmers' problems persisted, and the pressure on the government to find a solution did not abate. Subsequent attempts to control the emu population involved the deployment of civilian hunters and the implementation of bounty systems, which proved to be more effective, albeit still challenging and ongoing. The Great Emu War stands as a bizarre and cautionary tale in the annals of human interaction with the natural world. It highlights the potential for unintended consequences when human activities encroach upon wildlife habitats and the limitations of applying military solutions to ecological problems. The role of the media in shaping public perception, while secondary to the events themselves, underscores its power to influence opinion and scrutinize government actions. Ultimately, the Emu War serves as a humbling reminder of the resilience of nature and the often unpredictable outcomes of even the most well-intentioned interventions.